Well, hi, everybody, and welcome back to Riding a Wave. I'm Mark Healy, the editor-in-chief of the Wave newspaper, Rockaway's newspaper since 1893. And joining us today is Nick Davis. Nick is a producer, he's a director, he's a writer, and he's also now an author with his book, Competing with Idiots. It's a dual portrait of Herman and Joe Mankiewicz. And Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Obviously, writing a book of this nature would be hard enough if you were just writing about these two amazing people. But with you, this is something that took on a whole different way of storytelling because you're so connected to it.
Yes, Herman was my grandfather and Joe was my great uncle. And so the impetus for the book really was I'd been hearing about these guys my whole lives, and then not hearing about them and not seeing them in Joe's case, even though we lived like an hour away from him when I was growing up, but we never saw him, and he was just this sort of distant figure. And I got up into adulthood and wondered, well, wait a minute, who were these guys? Herman was this legendary, larger than life, people may know him from the recent movie Mank, where he was portrayed by Gary Oldman, and funny and loving and warm and wise in many ways, but also completely self-destructive and an alcoholic, and drank himself into an early grave and died well before I was born. And then Joe, his brother, was a much more successful, grounded individual. He wrote and directed, among others, All About Eve, Letter to Three Wives, and he won Best Director and Best Screenplay for both of those movies in back-to-back years, which is sort of the Johnny Vandermeer of Oscar winners. It's never been topped. It's never even been equaled. And it'd be very hard to be topped, it seems to me. But I just didn't really know who these guys were, and so set out to investigate it, over 20 years ago. And you make a good point, which it was harder in some ways because they were my family, but it was also, at a certain point I was having such trouble with the book, there's no question that I would have abandoned it had it been about, the Coen brothers or the Epstein brothers or the Weitz brothers or something. But you can't abandon a project like this about your family. Luckily I stuck with it, and it is now available wherever books are sold, as they say.
Well, look, I may be biased because I have such a fondness for you, but the book is so well done. It's so meticulous. It's so, something usually when you get a book like this that is so detailed, and really you lovingly share all the details, and you've done so much research. It could be ponderous to some, but you made this book where you're talking about these two brothers and really weaved both of their stories together in a way that I think that it certainly would have, it's hard enough to write a book about one person, least of all these two giants of film history. Was there any point when you began the book? Actually, let me say, when did this project start to, in your mind, say, I want to write this book, I want to do this special thing?
Well, I think it was actually sort of a long, believe it or not, even before I began it, I think I was thinking about it. I had an idea for a novel that would have been a fictionalization of Herman's life, although it would have used the name Herman Mankiewicz in 1990. And I started down that road and got nowhere and put it aside. And then in 2002, had an idea for a documentary about the two of them, Herman and Joe, based really in large part on an interpretation of All About Eve that I have to give my wife credit for, Jane, who is herself a wonderful wife and a novelist, and thinks in story terms, Jane Mendelsohn, and she we were watching All About Eve, and she said, "Oh, it's an emotional autobiography of Joe. He's writing about him and Herman, and Joe is Eve Harrington, and Herman is Margot Channing." And I thought, wow, I'm so glad I married you. What an interesting thing to say, and to think about these two characters: one who's larger than life and beloved and charismatic, and also self-destructive, Margot Channing, and then the younger, scheming artist who is cold and calculating, talented and ambitious, and just wants to take down the older artist. And to think about Joe, who was 11 and a half, 12 years younger than Herman, to think about the two of them in that way was just really interesting to me. So I went to American Masters, the great PBS documentary series, and Susan Lacey, who ran it then, sort of bought that pitch and said, "Oh, it's so interesting. Why don't you do a little bit of development on this? And we'll see if there's something there." So she gave me a little bit of money. I conducted a bunch of interviews, audio only, with my uncles and some cousins and Joe's agent. And then I ran into a friend of mine who was a book agent at a Christmas party in 2002. And he said, "What are you working on?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, let's do a companion book." And I thought, companion book, that's the kind of thing I like to hear. That'll write itself. So, not only does nothing write itself, but the documentary never happened. So then I'm left with, because clips are so expensive and whatever. So then I'm left with this book contract, which is hanging around my neck like an albatross. And the key for me was I was writing a very ponderous book for 5 or 6 years. It was very slow going. I was putting myself to sleep. The research was interesting, but I was just, it was bad. And then I had this kind of what I thought was a breakthrough. It led me down the wrong path, which was, oh, I see. The way to do this is not just to write about the biography of Joe and the biography of Herman, but also the biography of Nick. No one's more interesting than Nick. And there's so many interesting parallels. I'm self-destructive. I'm ambitious. Let me weave my story in. So I wrote it. I finally had a draft. And in 2011, so it had already been 9 years, I gave it to my editor, and she was like, "All right, well, this is what you had to do in order to write it. Now take yourself out." And she was very nice and gentle about it, but nobody cares about Nick Davis, and people care about Herman and Joe Mankiewicz. Take yourself out. So after a lot of kicking and screaming, I took myself out just one afternoon. I was like, well, let me just remove those parts. And I read it through, and it wasn't a full book by any means, but I really did see, oh, yes, it's no longer boring. It's coming from a perspective. And the earlier draft didn't have that. So now that I see this book is a portrait, it's not a biography. It's not a dual biography. It's a dual portrait. It's coming from my perspective. I think I tell pretty much their whole life stories, but it's very much coming from the point of view of the grandson or the great nephew of these two guys. And so that was how I was finally able to write it. And thank you for it not being ponderous. Believe me, I could send you the ponderous version, Mark. You would not, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Because it's, like I've gotten over the last, over the last couple of years, I get sent books a lot to review. And I do have this policy that if I don't like a book, I don't review it,
Right.
Because I don't want to, it's just a personal choice of mine. Right. So the books that I do select to do interviews like this, books that touch me, books that, I love film. I was an actor at one point in my life. So, to me, I love stories of old Hollywood. So what better way to read? I mean, when you talk about authenticity and someone who has grown up in that world, Nick, it's not just because, these two legends are your grandfather and great uncle respectively, but they were so important to the golden age of Hollywood. And when I know that you write the book, it just lends such credibility to it that, probably was daunting probably at points during this book. Yes.
Oh, totally. I mean, it was daunting to write the book. It was daunting to be related to those guys, and you know, not just say, oh, forget it, I'm going to be a dentist. You know, I mean, like, to go into the fields of writing or filmmaking as I have done, you know, with my eyes open, it's a thing, because how can you compete? You know, and that was what it was all about. It was all about competing for these guys, and that's where, you know, the title and all that comes from. But yes, and there were moments when it was incredibly daunting and hard. But I think, honestly, once I sort of realized, oh, it's my story and I don't need to be authoritative, I'm giving my opinions and not trying to, you know, overwhelm the viewer with my opinions, but I'm not writing, it doesn't need to be definitive. It's just the best I can do, you know, and so it became easier.
You know, I mentioned before how meticulous it is. And, you know, as someone who does a ton of research and writes so much background in everything I do, you know, which is hard in this world of, you know, 250 word stories and slideshows, you know, when you're trying to make sure that you're accurate, even if it is your opinion, even if it is your narrative, it still has to be accurate. So there's always that, you know, you know, demand as a writer that you want to be accurate in everything that you do. And you do that because there's a voluminous amount of notes and annotations that explain certain passages in the book. And I love that, you know, for me, because it gives some, you know, historical perspective. You know, something that might seem one way now was completely different back then. And I think you really, you know, you really did a great job in making sure that if there was a moment or a sentence or something that you referred to something, you made sure that you clarified it. How much help did you have with, because I just recently interviewed someone that had done a dual, you know, a dual treatment portrait, your word, of two pictures. And it was, you know, to me, it was, and, you know, I said, my God, that there was so much factual information that was written in such a helpful manner to explain some of the paragraphs. And they were like, yeah, well, we hired somebody to do that. Did you have help in that process, or did you do it all yourself?
No, the problem was I'm not by nature that organized. And so I would just be writing and think, well, I'll remember where I got this. You know, usually I would write, you know, and then such and such said, because I had all this material. It's sitting over there in my office closet. I had all this material from these two books that were written in the 70s, one about Joe, one about Herman. And I had those two authors, one was a family friend, the other was a super nice guy, gave me their interviews and their transcripts.
Wow.
So I had, and those were people who are long gone. So I was able to have interviews, you know, and use, you know, so Sidney Poitier said this about Joe. Now, Sidney Poitier is still here, but I didn't interview him. But because Ken Geist interviewed him in 1971 for the Joe book, I was able to have an interview with Sidney Poitier and say, Sidney Poitier said this about Joe. But no, the notes, I didn't take great notes. And so I was, at the end, I realized, okay, now it's time to do the notes. And I did hire somebody to help me. Like, I think I found it in this book, but I may have found it in that book. And look at these books, because I think it's from one of those books. And in certain cases, you know, we were able to find multiple citations of you know, quotations. But usually it was from the interviews that I got from these two writers, Ken Geist and Richard Merriman, from the 70s. And then, as you say, like, I did both endnotes and footnotes. So yeah. Sometimes I like footnotes and you can skip them, you know, but sometimes I had sort of more to say that was sort of off kilter or just to sort of deepen the story. Or again, it was another way of saying, like, don't take this as authoritative. Like, the footnote is telling you, look, here, this is my interpretation, and it may be something else going on here.
No, but I look, for some writers, I think that they would be, you know, just speaking for myself with my book, I did not do that because I just didn't have it in me to do it, and I had a very specific word count that I went over about 10,000 words. But
Right.
but that speaks to your skill in writing this book, because it really adds. It doesn't. I didn't want to skip the
Right.
footnotes.
Good.
I
Good.
didn't want to, because
There's
I just.
one I really regret. I have to say, there's one footnote that the copy editor suggested. He was like, "Why don't you do something about this? This is sort of interesting." I was like, "All right," and I did it. And then when I was reading the audio, I was lucky enough to read the audiobook, and I was reading the audiobook, and I read all the footnotes, and I got to that one. I was like, "Who cares?" I'd skip that one. So I didn't, there's one, I leave it to nobody to go on the hunt to try and figure out which of the 328 footnotes I didn't read. But there's one I feel like, that's unnecessary.
Well, did you do the audio book yourself? Yeah, you
Yeah.
did. Cool.
Yeah. It was really fun. Yeah. It was really fun.
Maybe I'll get some pointers, because I'm supposed to be doing one for my own. That were.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you're an actor. I am a retired ham actor, and it's just the most, it's just really fun. So.
Well, it's the thing about when you talk about the round table, the Algonquin round table, I found that fascinating because of the way that Herman and Sarah both reacted to being part of it. And for those who don't know what the Algonquin Round Table is, can you explain that a little bit? Because to me,
it's funny. Yeah, I'll explain a little bit. It was this place, the Algonquin was a hotel on, I think, West 44th or 45th Street in Manhattan, near the offices of the New Yorker and all the sort of, Time Magazine, the Times, all the newspapers were there. And it was where people went for lunch, and it turned into a big round table where people just went to make each other laugh. And the wit was flying, and it was like, it became legend. And funny sayings that people said then found their way into newspaper columns. And it was, in some ways, as you were talking, I realized it was kind of the Twitter of its day, because it was just like barbs, and it could get nasty, and people's feelings could get hurt. But ultimately, it didn't amount to anything. And I think it was Dorothy Parker, and it was all these famous wits: Dorothy Parker, the Marx Brothers, Haywood Brown, Wolcott, Gibbs, Herman Mankiewicz. They went, and just wit was flying, and it was great and fun. And sometimes people would go just to watch, And my grandmother, Sarah, went once with Herman and was totally silent. Like, she just wasn't gonna, because if you said anything, you could get attacked. But I think, ultimately, and Dorothy Parker said, we weren't actually getting anything done. Like, it's all very funny, but like the great work of the 20s was not actually being done by these people. Like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, they were writing great books. They weren't, wasting it on just funny lunches. And Herman was someone who just relished that. Like, that to him, that was it. Like, I'm being funny and I'm going to be talked about, and that's better than sitting down and polishing a written thing until it's really good and then putting it out in the world. He I think at some point, really consciously or not, decided that what he wanted was not to be a great writer, but to be a larger than life figure who is spoken about and is, frankly, the subject of movies 80 years later. I think that would have pleased Herman enormously early on. Like, if someone had said, kind of the best actor in the English language is going to play you in a movie, he'd be like, really? Okay. And called Mank, sign me up. That was enough. Sort of the Oscar Wilde, they said, he put his genius into his life and his talent into his work. I think that was Herman's ideal.
Well, and that's the thing that struck me, that he was such a big fan of the organic spoken word, that he didn't, like, you made a point of saying that, when people would say, oh, what did I just say? Write that down. And Herman did not want that. He didn't want a joke to be worked on and honed and then published. Like, he wanted that organic moment. And whereas his brother was the opposite. Now, that's kind of a simplistic comparison between the two. But what I got from reading was that maybe that's the essence of the difference between the two of them. Joe loved the movies and loved Hollywood. Herman, even though he was really good at it, hated it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, it is accurate. I think he felt he should have been doing something else. He felt it was beneath him. Both of them were raised by a really stern, imperious professor, Franz Mankiewicz, who, you bring home a 97 on a test. What happened to the other 3 points? And it's not funny what happened to it. Like, really, what happened to the other 3 points? And Herman just felt like, well, nothing I do will measure up, so the hell with it. I'm not even going to try, but at least I can be funny and lively. And, oh, look, now I'm out in Hollywood and I'm making all this money. I mean, the work is crap, but look, this is a good life and I'm funny and this is terrific. But in the back of his mind, he's thinking, I'm wasting my talents. I should be doing something great. And so he never even appreciated that he was working on, what became these films that were the golden age of Hollywood. And Joe, the next wave of screenwriters who came out to Hollywood didn't see it as a lark. They saw it as a good job. And look, this is the art form of the 20th century, and we're going to make great movies, and we're going to work on them and polish them. And they had a much different attitude, and Joe had a very different attitude. Yeah, I mean, Herman was the one who Herman would say, write that down. That was a good one. Make sure that spreads. He sent that telegram out to Ben Hecht. There's millions to be made out here, and your only competition is idiots.
Hence the title of the book.
That's the title of the book. Don't let this get. That's right. There you go. Yeah, so it was that was, I think that is the essential difference between the two guys.
So when we first met about a year ago, I guess a little bit more than a year ago, I had no idea of your background. And even when you had first reached out to me, to appear in your documentary, The 30 for 30, Once Upon a Time in Queens, I had no idea it was ESPN. I had no idea who Nick Davis was. So it's a good thing, because I think we would have probably talked for 3 hours about that rather than the Mets of 1986. And we'll do another podcast down the road with Nick about that, because that needs its own show. But I remember telling my wife when I got back, and I had looked it up and looked you up, and I was like, oh my God, like the Mankiewicz name. I'm a huge fan of Turner Classic Movies. So I'm a big fan of your cousin, Ben, who does a fantastic job. I followed him on Twitter long before, long before I even had any conscious idea of your relationship with him. And, growing up in this family, growing up in this legendary group of artists and people who have paved the way, and a lot of the family is in film. Yes.
Yeah. It's funny, because when I really think about it, and I write about this a little bit in even the book that remained. I didn't have a feeling that we were such a legendary family. I had a feeling that we were. And even now, I don't really think of it as legendary, but I had a feeling that we were sort of failed, that there had been great heights, obviously, Citizen Kane, All About Eve, but that, you know, Herman had drunk himself into an early grave, no money, and we'd gone bankrupt several times, and you know, we had no money. And Joe's side of the family was very distant from us. And when I was a kid, all I really knew about Joe was he made Cleopatra, and Cleopatra was the worst movie of all time. It was the biggest bomb of all time, nearly bankrupt the studio. So I was like, this isn't the great legacy, you know. I didn't feel like, yes, I'm a Kennedy or something, you know, or even a Coppola. There was shame attached to the name. A little bit, and so that was part of like becoming an adult, and then finally watching Joe's movies and thinking, wait a minute, this guy's great. These are terrific. And Herman, like, okay, he had personal problems, but he worked on a lot of great stuff. And you know, the tragedy is, you know, if only someone could have shaken him and said, come on, like, enjoy this. This is good. But you know, there were demons at work with both of them. Because Joe was not a particularly happy man either.
Right, but you know, like every family history has its heights and its valleys, right?
Right.
And so, you know, but that didn't seem to stop you from, you know, moving forward with your own career.
No, it didn't, and it was, but I had a hard time sort of finding my own path, and also because it's sort of like, well, how can I compete with these guys? How can I compete with Herman Mankiewicz? He wrote the greatest movie of all time, and he hated himself. So it's like, well, what do you do with that? Like, you can't even aspire to that, because that's no good. Like, it tied me in knots, and I think in my 20s and you know, to some extent even 30s and 40s and early 50s, I think there were things at work, and that's why I am personally so happy to be done with this book, because that was another thing where it was like, until I get this book done, it's like, now I can say to the world, look, this is who I am. This is where I come from. This is my story of these two guys. Hope you like it. But I've made peace with it at last, you know. But I'm no spring chicken. So I finally have reached some level of peace about it.
So when the movie Mank gets made, or when you first heard about it, at what part of the book process, when you first heard about the movie Mank being produced, what did you think about hearing that a film was going to be made about your grandfather?
Well, very complicated feelings, because at that point, when I first heard about it, I thought, I've got to finish this book. Like, come on, you know, this is ridiculous. And then, as it all sort of played out, I became enormously happy, because I got to a point where I finished the book. It was accepted. It's all going to happen. And then the movie is going to come out. And then it was like, well, but can you guys publish this book so that the book is there when the movie's out? No, our publication schedule is going to take too long, and it's going to be late. But it all kind of worked out, because now, you know, if this book had come out 2 years ago, a lot fewer people would have known who Herman Mankiewicz was. But now people know who he is, and he's entered the national imagination to some extent, and people can talk about him and you know, what'd you think of the movie? And oh, I hated it. Okay, fine, but it's about my grandfather, and here he is in this book. I loved it. Oh, good. He's about my grandfather. He's in this book. So yeah, I went through quite an evolution, but by the time the movie came out, I was totally overjoyed with the fact of it.
Right. You know, it's funny. As you know, I am someone who, you know, I always shoot straight, you know, and I, when people ask for my opinion, I, you know, happily give it. Even if sometimes like the truth or the honesty of it might hurt someone's feelings, I'd rather be true to who I am and true to my instincts. And there's been times in my life where somebody has asked me, oh, what did you think of this? And, you know, whether it's going to see one of my friends' plays or going to see, you know, my kids in a...
Looked like you had a lot of fun up there. Yeah.
You know.
How'd you memorize all those lines?
But, you know, that's why I think my friends learned not to ask if they weren't confident, you know. Right. But one of my favorite things is always to talk about a film. It drives my wife insane. But when I see a film, I love to talk about it, the things I like, the things I didn't like. And when you first asked me, when you had told me that this book was coming out, and you asked me about the film, did you see Mank? And I hesitated for a minute because I was like, does he like the movie? Is he happy about the movie? Is there something about, Gary Oldman's performance that he didn't like, or was the storytelling inaccurate? And it was just a moment. But then I told you, I said that I thought that Gary Oldman was fantastic. I love the fact that they went black and white. I really enjoyed it. I thought the performances, and that's for me. When the acting is really good, it's hard for me to see anything else. That's how I watch a film. And let me ask you, because I didn't really ask you, but how did you feel about the film and Gary Oldman's performance specifically?
Well, I'm the last person whose opinion I trust about that movie. I'm such a reed in the wind that I think, well, first of all, except Oldman was great. A totally wonderful, warm, wise performance. Is it my grandfather? No, it's someone's grandfather. He was doing a voice that seemed like a sort of old, call me Mank, like a kind of old cartoon, like a Warner Brothers cartoon, not the voice that I imagined Herman Mankiewicz had. But it was a wonderful performance, and the film was made with so much love and care. I do think that there was perhaps a little too much care. I think that there is a slightly fussed over quality to that movie, and to most of Fincher's movies. He's so controlling and so brilliant that I felt an absence of the kind of improvisational, accidental pleasures, incidental pleasures kind of thing that animated Citizen Kane and animated Hollywood in the 30s and early 40s. And so I missed that. But I mean, it's very hard for me to complain at all about the movie. I thought, and there's so many wonderful things. And you're right, the performances were great. Just all wonderful.
Well, it's always hard. It's always hard when you're personally connected to something, and not look at it in that critical way. And I don't mean critical as in negative. I mean in breaking it down to the different things. Just as anything that anything. If I ever write something that gets to the screen or gets to be performed on a stage, I'll have that same insight. And it doesn't mean that you didn't like it or it was negative. It just wasn't maybe when somebody gets cast in something. You talk about Oldman's voice, right? I think about Daniel Day-Lewis's Abraham Lincoln and the voice that he used for that. I
love that voice.
Winston Churchill is always portrayed as this, mellifluous voice, where maybe he didn't have the most mellifluous voice, commanding voice. So, there's dramatic license, but, obviously I wanted to ask about that because I think that anyone who watched that film or anyone who's interested in film history is going to love this book because of all the intricacies of it, the things that you just talked about, that vibrancy of early Hollywood and how these things, I mean, I love trivia, right? So you wrote about how Herman was the guy who came up with My Little Chickadee for W.C. Fields.
Joe came up with My Little Chickadee.
Right.
No, that's fine. I mean, that's the great tragedy. The first part of Joe's career is that everybody thought he was Herman, and so it got so bad that Joe was saying, his epitaph on his tombstone was going to say, "Here lies Joe Mankiewicz."
Right.
Joe came up with My Little Chickadee and then sold it apparently to W.C. Fields for $50.
It's just, it's like Kramer, Kramer, selling his stories to, and the name escapes me because I have turned into Morty Seinfeld. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning and I can't remember anything. But it's funny, when you write a book like this, and you know, it's something, would you say that this is something that was in your wheelhouse, or did you have to make it your wheelhouse when you decided to finally go through with the writing of it? Was it something like, wow, I've never written anything like this before. How am I going to get into it and make it as good as, let's say, my Ted Williams film that I did for ESPN? Like, was it part of your toolbox, or was it something that you had to, talk yourself into, or how did that?
I think I had to fool myself. I think I definitely had to fool myself. And I mean, look, I never wanted to write this book. I mean, let's be honest, I never wanted to call myself a writer. And so it was going to happen, actually first I was going to have a co-writer, and it was going to be a companion book, and I was going to hire somebody to work on it while I'm working on the documentary. Well, then the documentary goes away, so I don't have the money to hire a co-writer. But even so, I'm going to somehow do it without thinking, and honestly, the first, whatever it was, 8-10 years, I was not consciously doing it. And then, as I said, I had this breakthrough, and I wrote that draft, and it was like, whoa, I have a voice. I get it. Okay. Then she said, take yourself out of it. I don't want to take myself out of it. I did. I was like, all right, I got it. And I have the voice now. Still a lot of research to do, still a lot of stuff to do. But from that point on, I felt like, yeah, I got this. And I don't know how good it's going to be, and I don't know, I'm not saying how good it is, but it's not something where I'm worried, I'm no longer obsessing about, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm not a writer, who am I fooling, all that stuff did finally go away late, but late in an 18-19 year process.
Well, I mean, I think that knowing that people watching this or listening to this and hearing that, I think is an inspiration, because we don't know what we're capable of until we're actually doing it, And I remember part of my process as an actor, sometimes when I was playing a role that I wasn't really familiar with, that I would overcompensate, or I would undercompensate, or I would try an accent, or I would, whatever it was to make it work and make it real, make it so that the character rang true. It's the same with the writing process. I was doing this in an interview the other day. Somebody asked me, did you go to school for writing? Did you go to school for journalism? No, I didn't. I was an actor. That's what I did. But in the process of creating backstories for my actor, the characters I was playing, that's where I learned how to write. That's where I learned how to, how to hone that craft. It was by doing, not by studying, and not by, obviously the studying and all that other stuff comes later and adds, obviously, a foundation to what you're doing, but it's good to know, and I think it's helpful for people to know that it is a process, and sometimes
it's a process. For me, I mean, it can take a really long time, and you have to be patient and find your own way. Like, everybody has different. You read about, like, well, Hemingway woke up at 6 and he wrote until noon, and then he went hunting or whatever. And everybody's got their own thing. And there are some people who sit down every day and write, and that's their thing, that works for them. And there are other people, my wife is a novelist. She only writes when she wants to write. She keeps, and I mean, her stories are all so different. And everybody has their own way of doing things, and you have to find your own way. And so, like, I would hear people say, you've got to write every day. And I would think, I'm not writing every day. This is never going to happen. And look, I mean, there were many years when it seemed like this isn't going to happen. How is this? Who's doing this? Because I'm not, Right. But eventually you do, if you stick with it in some way, and you can't envision a scenario where you're not doing it, I couldn't imagine how is this life going to happen, and you never write this book? That was unthinkable to me.
It was amazing. Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, a dual portrait by Nick Davis. It's available everywhere where bookstores are sold. The audiobook is available. And Nick, this could go on for hours. But
Well, thank you, Mark.
I have work to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah,
So
we have stuff, we've got lives we've got to get to.
and just thank you so much for joining us today. Oh, one last thing for you Rockaway people that are listening.
Oh, yeah.
Herman and his wife, Sarah, had their honeymoon right here in Rockaway.
Yes, they did. And
You remember where they stayed?
I don't. If it's not in the book, I think it was just a hotel by the sea. And the insane, crazy thing for a man who was so dominated by his domineering father, and you would think, at last, I'm married, I get away from my dad. They brought Franz on the honeymoon. So,
That was great. I was like, I got to remember to mention that.
Yeah.
And it's just great stuff, Nick. And thank
Yeah.
you so much for writing this book. And
Thank you.
And thank you for stopping by with us today. I really appreciate it.
You got it. We'll talk again. It's great to see you, Mark. Thanks.
Take care, my friend.
Bye-bye.